My name is Shannon Stone, and at 29 years old, I silently run a billion-dollar empire called Stone Ventures. But to the people sending this invitation, I am just a failure who was kicked out 5 years ago for choosing technology over law school. I walked past my collection of pristine supercars in the garage and deliberately chose a rusting Honda Civic that looked ready for the scrapyard. My sister thinks she invited a punching bag to her new mansion to entertain her wealthy friends with my misery. I tossed the invite onto the passenger seat of the old car because tonight was not about family bonding. This was a calculated summons to a public execution disguised as a housewarming party where they planned to mock my poverty. I started the engine with a loud rattling noise and smiled because the chaos I was about to unleash would be legendary. And when it was over so fast, no one even understood what happened. The party didn't last 5 minutes. I walked out of the mansion with whispers exploding behind me. Outside the front gate, 2 Rolls-Royces were already waiting like they had been standing guard for their rightful owner. The doors swung open, headlights reflecting off flawless black paint. I stepped inside without looking back, and let them watch me leave in a way they never saw coming. If you want to see how a rusted Honda and a hidden billionaire shut down a generic housewarming party in less than 5 minutes, then please hit that subscribe button right now, because this satisfaction is something you do not want to miss. The atmosphere within the executive suite of Stone Ventures was significantly heavier than usual earlier that morning, as the rising sun cast long shadows across the mahogany furniture. A thick black folder landed on my desk with a heavy thud that seemed to echo the seriousness of the situation we were about to address. My lawyer, Liam, stood across from me with a grim expression on his face while he prepared to walk me through the documents that would seal the fate of my estranged family. He began to present the intricate details of the financial fraud that had been plaguing Apex Solutions for the past 24 months, under the negligent supervision of its previous ownership. I listened intently as he explained how my sister Courtney Stone and my brother-in-law Todd Harrison had been systematically draining company resources to fund a lifestyle they could not legitimately afford. The evidence suggested that they treated the corporate bank accounts as their personal piggy banks, while completely disregarding the financial health of the organization they were supposed to be serving. I reached out to flip through the stack of bank statements that Liam had highlighted in yellow to show the specific transactions where the embezzlement was most blatant. My eyes widened in disgust as I saw transfer after transfer labeled as client entertainment expenses, which were actually funneled directly into personal luxury purchases. The most shocking revelation was a series of massive payments that were supposedly for business development, but matched the exact deposit amounts for the sprawling mansion in Saddle River. They were building their dream home on a foundation of stolen money while laughing at me for driving a car that was older than their marriage. It was infuriating to realize that the very house they were inviting me to celebrate tonight was paid for by the company that I had just purchased outright a few hours ago. Courtney and Todd were living in a fantasy world constructed on fraud, and I now held the legal power to tear it all down with a single signature. The heavy silence in my office was suddenly broken by the ringing of my private cell phone, which displayed the name of the only person outside this building who knew my true identity. My best friend Emily was calling with a voice full of genuine concern because she was terrified that I was walking into an emotional trap that would hurt me more than them. She pleaded with me to reconsider my plan to attend the party because she believed that sending the authorities to arrest them would be justice enough without reopening my old wounds. I leaned back in my leather chair while holding the phone tight against my ear because I needed her to understand why this personal confrontation was necessary for my closure. I told her that I needed to look them in the eye one last time to see if there was any shred of humanity left, or if they were truly as rotten as these financial records suggested. Emily sighed on the other end of the line, but eventually agreed to support whatever decision I made because she knew how much pain they had caused me over the years. After ending the call with Emily, I opened a locked drawer in my desk to retrieve a crumpled picture of my family that I had kept hidden away for 5 long years. I stared at the faces of my parents, Robert and Linda, remembering how they used to look at me with sheer disappointment whenever I touched a computer instead of a law textbook. They always called Courtney their golden child, who would bring honor to the family name while I was cast aside as the stubborn failure who would never amount to anything. I remembered the night they threw my laptop out into the rain and told me to leave if I refused to follow their rigid path to success. That memory fueled a cold fire in my chest that burned away any lingering hesitation I might have felt about ruining their perfect evening. I looked up at Liam, who was patiently waiting for my final directive, and gave him the order that would seal their fate. I instructed him to mobilize the entire legal department immediately and to have 2 black Rolls-Royce Phantoms waiting exactly 2 blocks away from the mansion to extract me once the deed was done. That night, my old Honda Civic made an embarrassing rattling noise as it pulled up to the ornate iron gates of the estate in Saddle River. I could feel the vibration of the decaying engine through the steering wheel as the vehicle coughed and sputtered like a dying animal amidst the silence of the wealthy neighborhood. A stern security guard stepped out of the booth with a look of absolute annoyance plastered across his face when he saw my car approaching the entrance. He did not even bother to check his clipboard for my name because he immediately assumed that someone driving such a dilapidated vehicle could only be a delivery driver who was lost. The man marched over to my window and rapped his knuckles hard against the glass while gesturing aggressively for me to turn around and leave the premises immediately. I felt a surge of amusement mixed with irritation as I realized that my own family had likely instructed him to keep the riffraff out without realizing that category included me. I rolled down the manual window with a squeaking sound to explain that I was actually an invited guest, but before I could get a single word out, the front door of the mansion swung open. Todd walked down the long driveway with a crystal wine glass in his hand, looking every bit the arrogant aristocrat he pretended to be. Courtney followed closely behind him, her eyes widening in horror as she recognized the rusting vehicle that was currently blocking her majestic entryway. They stopped on the other side of the gate, staring at me through the iron bars as if I were a zoo animal that had escaped from its cage. Todd took a sip of his wine and let out a harsh laugh that grated on my ears before shaking his head in disbelief at the sight before him. "Good God, Shannon! Where did you find that scrap heap? Don't tell me you plan to drive it into my driveway. It will pollute the entire neighborhood." I watched as Courtney frantically scanned the street to ensure that none of her wealthy neighbors were witnessing this humiliating spectacle on her big night. She looked as though she wanted to dig a hole in the perfectly manicured lawn and bury herself in it, rather than acknowledge that she was related to the person in the car. Her face flushed a deep shade of crimson as she realized that the security guard was still standing there witnessing this awkward family reunion. Instead of defending me or greeting her sister after 5 years, she marched up to the gate with a scowl that deepened the wrinkles on her forehead. She hissed at me through the bars with sheer venom in her voice, terrified that my poverty might be contagious to her high society reputation. "How could you come here looking like this? I told you this was an upscale party. Drive this car to the back gate immediately. Don't let my guests see you." Just as I was about to shift the car into reverse to comply with her ridiculous demands, the front door opened again to reveal my parents stepping out onto the porch. Robert and Linda walked slowly down the path, their expressions shifting from curiosity to disdain the moment they laid eyes on my vehicle. I felt a tiny spark of hope that perhaps my mother would have missed me, but that hope was extinguished the second our eyes locked. There was no warmth in her gaze, only the cold calculation of a woman who was worried about appearances above all else. She did not open the gate or offer a hug. She simply stood beside Courtney and waved her hand at me as if she were shooing away a stray dog. "Use the kitchen entrance designated for the help. And please do not speak to anyone about your profession. I do not want to explain why the youngest Stone daughter is such a miserable failure." I gripped the steering wheel tightly to stop my hands from shaking, not from sadness, but from the sheer audacity of their cruelty. I nodded slowly at them without saying a word, because I knew that any argument would only prolong this agonizing encounter. They turned their backs on me and walked back toward the house, laughing among themselves, as if they had just solved a minor pest problem. I shifted the gear stick and drove slowly around the perimeter of the estate toward the servants' entrance as instructed. This was exactly what I needed to see to confirm that my decision to destroy them was absolutely the right one. A few minutes after sneaking in through the grease-stained kitchen door like a common thief, I chose a secluded corner in the magnificent living room to observe the grotesque spectacle unfolding before me. The interior of the house was decorated with an abundance of gold leaf and velvet that screamed for attention. But to my eyes, it only looked like a desperate attempt to cover up the emptiness of the people living inside it. I stood quietly in the shadows while holding a glass of tap water because I refused to drink even a single drop of the expensive champagne that I knew had been purchased with stolen corporate funds. My eyes scanned the room until they landed on Todd, who was currently leading a group of sycophantic colleagues toward a massive glass display case filled with vintage wine bottles. He was holding court like a king in his castle while pointing at a dusty bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon that he claimed was a personal gift from a European diplomat. My stomach turned with disgust because I recognized that specific vintage from the invoice Liam had shown me earlier that morning in my office. It was not a generous gift from anyone, but rather a piece of corporate property that he had brazenly stolen from the company warehouse to impress his shallow friends. He was bragging loudly about the subtle notes of oak and berry, while I silently tallied up the criminal charges that were about to rain down on his arrogant head. Courtney suddenly spotted me standing alone near the wall while I was trying to blend into the background, and a cruel glint appeared in her eyes. She realized that having her less fortunate sister present was the perfect opportunity to make her own success shine even brighter by comparison. She clapped her hands sharply to gather the attention of the surrounding guests and gestured for me to step forward into the center of the room like a circus animal. I could see the malicious excitement on her face as she prepared to turn her own flesh and blood into a punchline for her evening entertainment. She walked over to me with a predatory smile and placed a hand on my shoulder before addressing the room with a voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Everyone, let me introduce you quickly. This is Shannon, my sister. She is a bit shy because life has not been very lucky for her, spending all day just burying her face in repairing old computers." The sophisticated crowd erupted into a chorus of condescending laughter that echoed off the high ceilings of the stolen mansion as they looked at my simple attire with open judgment. They began whispering loud enough for me to hear every insulting word, asking each other if I could afford to pay rent this month or if I was still living in my parents' basement. One woman with too much plastic surgery asked me if I knew how to fix her printer because she didn't want to pay the technician fees at the store. They were feeding off Courtney's energy and treating me like a social outcast who had stumbled into their polished world by mistake. It was a disgusting display of mob mentality where wealthy adults felt comfortable bullying someone they perceived as financially inferior just to make themselves feel superior. Todd strutted over to join the fun and draped his heavy arm around my shoulders in a gesture of mock affection that made my skin crawl with revulsion. He raised his voice to ensure that every person in the room, from the waiters to the executives, could hear his display of faux generosity toward his destitute sister-in-law. The room fell into an expectant silence as they waited to hear what crumbs the benevolent master of the house would throw to the beggar standing in their midst. He looked down at me with a smirk that was supposed to look charitable, but only succeeded in looking incredibly smug. "Hey, Shannon. I heard you are struggling to find work. My company is currently hiring night shift cleaning staff. If you want, I will put in a good word for you." I clenched my hand into a fist inside my pocket until my fingernails dug into my palm while my fingers brushed against the phone that was recording every single word of this interaction. It took every ounce of self-control I possessed to keep my facial expression neutral instead of slapping the smug grin off his face right then and there. I knew that the satisfaction of destroying him legally would be far greater than any physical retaliation I could offer in this moment. I looked up at him with dead eyes and delivered a response that was laced with enough ice to freeze the entire room. "Thank you for your kindness, Todd. But I think you should worry about your own seat before worrying about finding jobs for other people." Just as the mocking laughter of the crowd was reaching its absolute peak, the heavy chime of the main doorbell rang out to signal the arrival of a powerful figure. The sound acted like an immediate switch on Todd, transforming his demeanor from an arrogant bully into a desperate sycophant within a fraction of a second. He frantically adjusted his silk tie and smoothed down the lapels of his suit jacket while signaling for the other guests to clear a wide path toward the entrance. His face was flushed with excitement as he prepared to welcome the man he believed was the ultimate validator of his success and the guarantor of his lavish lifestyle. He raised his hands to silence the murmuring crowd, ensuring that every person in the room understood the significance of the guest who was about to walk through the door. "Everyone quiet down now. My general manager, the esteemed Mr. Henderson, has arrived. This is the true class of the Stone family." The heavy oak doors swung open to reveal Mr. Henderson stepping into the foyer, but his appearance was starkly different from the triumphant entrance that Todd had clearly anticipated. The CEO of Apex Solutions did not look like a man arriving at a celebration, but rather like a man walking toward his own execution with beads of cold sweat glistening visibly on his forehead. His eyes were not admiring the expensive architecture or the well-dressed guests, but instead were darting frantically around the room as if he were searching for a hidden bomb. I watched from my dark corner with a calm sense of satisfaction, because I knew exactly why the usually composed executive looked like he was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. He had received the notification of the acquisition hours ago and knew that his job was currently hanging by a very thin thread. Courtney and Todd rushed forward to greet him with smiles that were so wide they looked painful, completely oblivious to the panic radiating from their boss. Todd grabbed the bottle of stolen vintage wine he had been bragging about earlier and poured a generous glass, thrusting it toward Mr. Henderson with a trembling hand. He began to babble incessantly about the custom Italian marble floors and the crystal chandelier, trying desperately to impress the man who held his career in his hands. But Mr. Henderson did not even glance at the wine or the house. He simply swatted Todd's hand away with a gesture of pure impatience that stunned the room into silence. "Put the wine aside, Todd. Where is the chairman? Has she arrived yet? Why didn't you inform me that she would be present here?" A wave of confusion washed over the faces of both Todd and Courtney as they exchanged bewildered glances, completely unable to comprehend what their boss was talking about. They had spent their entire careers believing that Mr. Henderson was the highest authority at the company, unaware that a board of directors and a chairman existed above him. In their narrow minds, there was no one more powerful than the man standing in front of them, so the question seemed utterly nonsensical. Courtney tried to laugh it off, assuming that perhaps he was referring to her father or some other male figure, never once suspecting that the power dynamic had shifted. Mr. Henderson ignored their confusion and continued his desperate visual sweep of the crowded living room, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. Then his gaze finally pierced through the crowd and landed on the shadowed corner near the kitchen entrance where I was standing silently. The color drained from his face instantly, leaving him looking as pale as a sheet of paper, as if he had just seen a ghost manifest in the middle of the party. He did not see a failure or a poor relative. He saw the new owner of his company, the woman who held the power to destroy everything he had built. Without saying another word to his hosts, he abandoned the center of the room and began walking briskly toward me with an urgency that bordered on panic. Todd noticed the direction his boss was heading and immediately assumed that Mr. Henderson had made a mistake or was simply lost in the large house. Panic flared in his eyes as he realized the distinguished CEO was approaching the family embarrassment, and he scrambled to intercept him before the evening was ruined. He lunged forward to grab Mr. Henderson's arm, desperate to steer him back toward the VIP guests and away from the woman he had just labeled a cleaner. "Boss, where are you going? That is just Shannon, my sister-in-law. She is an unemployed, nobody don't let her dirty your suit." The moment Mr. Henderson stood in front of me and bowed at a 90-degree angle, time seemed to stop for everyone present. The heavy silence that descended upon the room was so absolute that the only sound was the terrified breathing of the man who had previously been the most powerful person in the room. Every guest froze in place with their drinks halfway to their mouths, while their eyes widened in disbelief at the sight of the CEO submitting himself to the woman they had just been mocking. Mr. Henderson remained in that lowered position for several agonizing seconds to demonstrate his total submission before he slowly straightened up to face me with eyes full of fear. He clasped his hands together in front of him to stop them from shaking visibly, while beads of sweat rolled down his pale temples. He spoke with a voice that quivered with genuine terror, because he knew that his entire professional future depended on how I chose to react to his apology. "Chairman Stone, I am terribly sorry. I did not know you had arrived. I should have been at the gate to greet you. Please forgive this negligence." The sound of shattering glass suddenly pierced the silence like a gunshot as Courtney lost her grip on her expensive crystal wine flute. The red liquid splashed violently across the hem of her designer dress and stained the white carpet she was so proud of, but she did not even look down to notice the mess she had made. Her face had drained of all color as she stared at the scene before her, with her mouth hanging open in a grotesque expression of shock. Todd looked as though someone had physically struck him across the face because his brain simply could not process the impossible reality unfolding in his living room. He looked frantically back and forth between me and his boss while searching for some logical explanation that would restore his world to its previous order. He let out a nervous chuckle that sounded more like a choke as he pointed a trembling finger in my direction to dispute the absurd claim. "Boss, you are joking, right? This is Shannon. She drives a wrecked Honda. She is the one our parents kicked out. How can she be the chairman?" Mr. Henderson spun around to face his subordinate with a look of pure fury contorting his features, because Todd's stupidity was actively digging a deeper grave for all of them. The older man realized that any association with Todd was currently a liability that could cost him his pension and his reputation in the industry. He stepped forward aggressively to cut off Todd's rambling denial before it could cause any further offense to the woman who signed his paychecks. His voice boomed across the living room with enough authority to make several guests flinch as he delivered the truth that shattered Todd's delusions forever. "Shut your mouth immediately, Todd. This is Ms. Shannon Stone, the founder of Stone Ventures. This morning she acquired 100% of Apex's shares. She is the owner of the company, she is my boss, and she is yours too." A collective gasp swept through the crowd as the weight of that revelation settled over the room like a heavy blanket of suffocation. I took a slow step forward from the corner where I had been hiding, shedding the persona of the shy and rejected sister like an old coat. I straightened my posture to stand at my full height while letting the cold confidence of a billionaire business owner radiate from my presence. I looked directly into Todd's eyes with a predator's gaze and allowed a chilling smile to curl the corners of my lips as I watched his arrogance crumble into dust. My parents stood frozen like statues near the hallway entrance with expressions of absolute horror etched onto their aging faces. Mom raised a trembling hand to cover her mouth as she stared at the daughter she had forced to use the servants' entrance only 30 minutes ago. She looked at my simple clothes again, but this time she did not see poverty. She saw the understated power of a woman who did not need to shout to be heard. They realized with a sickening jolt that the failure they had discarded was actually the most powerful person in the room, and they had just treated her like garbage in front of the very people she now commanded. The housewarming party officially turned into a public trial when I signaled Liam to open the leather briefcase he had brought into the room. He stepped forward with the efficiency of a seasoned executioner and connected his tablet wirelessly to the massive television screen mounted above the fireplace. The slideshow of Courtney and Todd posing vainly on their tropical vacations abruptly vanished, replaced instantly by a stark spreadsheet filled with highlighted numbers and banking transaction codes. A collective murmur of confusion rippled through the gathered guests as they squinted to read the headers which clearly displayed the unauthorized transfers from the corporate accounts of Apex Solutions. I watched the color drain from Todd's face as he recognized the incriminating digital paper trail that he thought he had successfully buried under layers of creative accounting. He made a desperate move to stand in front of the screen to block the view, but a sharp glare from Mr. Henderson froze him in his tracks like a deer caught in headlights. I walked slowly toward the center of the room, allowing my heels to click rhythmically against the expensive hardwood floor that my money had paid for. I pointed a steady finger at the screen, where a specific transaction matching the exact down payment of this estate was glowing in bright red. The room fell into a deathly silence as the guests realized they were not attending a celebration of success, but rather standing inside the physical evidence of a massive corporate crime. I turned my gaze to the trembling couple who were shrinking under the weight of the truth and delivered the verdict that would dismantle their entire existence. "You are proud of this house, aren't you? Let me tell you something. Every single brick here was bought with stolen money from my company. And now I am here to take back what is rightfully mine." I did not wait for them to come up with a pathetic lie, because the evidence beaming behind me was irrefutable in a court of law. I announced clearly that Todd and Courtney were terminated from their positions effective immediately due to gross misconduct and embezzlement of company funds. I further declared that since the property was purchased with stolen corporate assets, the deed was being legally contested, and the house was now under the seizure of Stone Ventures to recoup the losses. The gasp that escaped Courtney's lips was audible across the room as the reality of her situation crashed down on her like a tidal wave. She looked around at her friends who were now backing away from her as if she were contagious, realizing that her social status had evaporated in an instant. Courtney burst into hysterical tears and lunged toward me with desperation etched into her makeup-streaked face, abandoning all her previous arrogance. She tried to grab my hands to beg for mercy, but my security team stepped in seamlessly to create a physical barrier between us. She collapsed onto her knees on the floor she no longer owned, reaching out through the wall of bodyguards while sobbing uncontrollably. She decided to play the only card she had left, the very same card she had spat on earlier that evening when she made me use the servant's entrance. "Shannon, please. We are sisters. We have the same blood running through our veins. You cannot do this to me. You cannot kick me out onto the street. Please think about Mom and Dad." My parents, who had been standing in stunned silence near the doorway, suddenly sprang into action upon hearing their names mentioned. They rushed forward with a newfound warmth that was sickeningly transparent, pushing past the confused guests to reach me. Mom reached out as if to stroke my arm, her face twisting into a mask of pleading concern that completely contradicted the disgust she had shown me at the gate. She spoke with a trembling voice, trying to frame this massive theft as a simple family misunderstanding that could be solved with a hug. They were terrified not for their daughters, but for the loss of the financial safety net they had always assumed Courtney would provide. I took a deliberate step back to avoid her touch, looking at them with eyes that held no warmth, no anger, just the cold indifference of a stranger. I remembered the freezing rain soaking my clothes 5 years ago while they sat comfortably inside, and that memory fortified my resolve against their manipulation. I looked from my weeping sister to my hypocritical parents and delivered the final emotional severance that would cut the cord forever. "Do not mention the word family to me ever again. That family died 5 years ago when you threw my computer and my future out into the rain. From this moment on, the relationship between us is simply that of a creditor and a debtor." 15 minutes later, the wail of police sirens tore through the quiet night air of the wealthy Saddle River neighborhood. The rhythmic flashing of red and blue lights bounced off the walls of the seized mansion as the Economic Crimes Unit stormed through the entrance I had unlocked. I stood silently near the ornate doorway, watching the absolute disintegration of my sister's carefully constructed social life as the guests scrambled to find the nearest exit like rats fleeing a sinking ship. Todd tried to argue with the lead officer about his rights, but was silenced immediately when the cold steel of handcuffs clicked tightly around his wrists, while he wept openly in front of his fleeing colleagues. Courtney was already being escorted out in disgrace, her expensive mascara running down her cheeks in black streaks, screaming hysterically about how this was all a terrible misunderstanding that could be fixed with a single phone call. I turned my back on the pathetic scene and walked calmly out through the massive double front doors that I had been forbidden to use just an hour ago. The night air filled my lungs with a sweetness that tasted like pure freedom, a sensation far more intoxicating than the expensive wine they had been serving all night. I walked down the stone steps with my head held high, leaving the chaotic screams of my former family echoing impotently within the walls of a house they no longer owned. My rusted Honda Civic was still parked crookedly in the driveway, like a stubborn relic of the past, standing as a silent witness to the history that had just been rewritten. But directly behind it, the darkness was illuminated by the pristine headlights of two phantom black Rolls-Royces that glided silently toward me, with the Stone Ventures flags fluttering proudly on the hoods. The lead driver, dressed in a crisp white uniform, stepped out and opened the heavy rear door with a deep bow of respect that contrasted sharply with the way I had been treated all evening. Just as I placed one foot inside the plush interior, I heard the frantic footsteps of my parents crunching on the gravel driveway behind me. They were running toward the car, with absolute desperation in their eyes, banging their fists against the reinforced glass window while screaming about their retirement funds and asking where they would live tomorrow. I did not turn my head to look at them, nor did I instruct the driver to lower the window to hear their begging pleas for financial salvation. I simply settled into the soft leather seat and gave a small nod to the driver, signaling him to take me away from the toxicity that had plagued my life for too long. As the heavy vehicle rolled smoothly down the street, I watched in the rearview mirror as the lights of the mansion grew smaller and eventually disappeared into the darkness. I realized in that quiet moment that my victory was not defined by the billions in my bank account or the luxury car I was riding in. My true triumph was the courage to sever the poisonous cord that bound me to people who only loved me when I was useful to them. This story serves as a powerful reminder that we must never judge the worth of another human being based solely on their outward appearance or the vehicle they drive. True power is often silent and understated, while those who shout the loudest about their success are often hiding the deepest insecurities and deceit. We also learn that any life built upon a foundation of lies and arrogance is destined to crumble the moment the truth is revealed, just as Courtney's mansion collapsed under the weight of her fraud. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, this journey teaches us that the greatest act of self-love is sometimes the ruthless decision to cut ties with family members who constantly drain your spirit.